Do you build up resentment or feel extremely upset when you make a mistake? The reality is we all make mistakes and will face some sort of failure in our lives. But if you don't manage your failures properly and give yourself some grace, you will find yourself full of disappointment, bitterness, regret, resentment, and you will certainly self-loathe. If you are new here, hey, my name is Brianna from Self-Love Starts Now, and I started my business several years ago teaching self-love. And what really gets me is people's perspective of what self-love is. People really believe that self-love is going on a shopping spree. I have gone out on the streets and surveyed people because I was just curious of what people's perspective of self-love was. And even when I have interviewed men, they have also said things like getting new sneakers or treating themselves to something nice, right? As women, we love to get our nails done or our hair done, and all of those things are really nice, but that definitely shouldn't be our only perspective of self-love. If someone did not have additional income and they weren't able to splurge and treat themselves, does that mean they are not able to love themselves? Of course not. Self-love is being patient and kind to yourself, showing compassion to yourself, because that's actually much harder than going and buying yourself something, although that is nice too. I teach that self-love is treating yourself with patience and kindness, and that's why it was so important for me to make this video. Grace unlocks a door towards freedom. With that said, I would be remiss to not mention that there are some of us who are not exercising self-discipline the way we should be. And instead of owning up and taking accountability, we say, oh, we're giving ourselves a break or we're giving ourselves grace. So with this conversation of grace, let's have maturity and honestly just do the things that we need to do without putting a grace blanket on everything. With grace, the definition I am speaking of to pardon or excuse. Grace looks like making a mistake and feeling disappointed, and instead of beating yourself up about it, you excuse it. Okay, I know there are some of you guys who had perfect attendance in school. I was not one of them. From my knowledge, from my understanding, every state has some set of laws where children cannot miss a certain amount of school days. If they did, of course, teachers, principals, they would be concerned, where is this student? Or let's even take for work, because with work, for most jobs, typically there is a job description and a set of guidelines that you sign a contract for. So you will have literally designated sick days, personal time, vacation days, maybe bereavement days. And so you could use those days. But when you exceed those days, what happens? Depending on your job, your company, maybe how they already are feeling about you, if you exceed those days, you will either be written up or just fired immediately. But the thing is, if something were to happen to you, you would be able to go to a doctor, a surgeon, and request paperwork to excuse you. There are situations that you could have a letter from a professional or a death certificate if someone in your family passed away, where you could excuse a situation. I remember I bought plane tickets and I thought I was buying the insurance, and I was not. It was a third-party insurance company, and essentially they were really not insuring your trip like I thought it was. I didn't read the fine print, and the only way they were willing to refund me is if I had a death certificate, which I didn't. But the point is that letter would excuse you from the typical consequences. And I really like that definition for grace, because it's not an excuse to just make mistakes all the time or just live a life that's lackadaisical. It's saying that, you know what, when you do make a mistake, I am going to excuse you. I'm going to give you that one document that will pardon you from the consequences or punishment that you may typically face. Now, granted, of course, there's still consequences in life, but when I think about being able to give a letter to an employer or something like that to excuse you from a particular situation, that letter is saying, this doesn't happen all the time, so grant an allowance to that person. When I think about giving grace to myself, I know that I typically don't do certain things. I don't live a reckless life where I'm purposely doing things to hurt others, where I'm purposely working against my goals. And so if I make a mistake and have a failure in an area, I'm choosing to grant myself an allowance. Like, this does not happen all the time. So Brianna, give yourself a break. At some point of my college years, I ended up dropping out. For the years I didn't go to college, I was really just working on being in a better place mentally and emotionally. Now, I don't really know if it was the time where my peers were graduating and maybe I was looking at pictures. I don't really know what triggered it, but I remember there was a season that I was really feeling down and disappointed. And I was just like, I should be graduating. Like, look at my age. I was totally not working on a career. I don't even know what I was doing. And my mother asked me, how many of your peers lost a parent? In that moment, I really had so much grace for myself because the people I may have been comparing myself to or looking at the fact they graduated or were graduating, they had not gone through the storms I went through in that time of my life. You see, at that time, I had a host of issues. I lost a parent, then had family issues, financial issues. But instead of accounting for those things, I was looking at where I was and where I wasn't. I was focused on essentially the poor grades I earned and how I eventually dropped out. There are times in life where you have to give yourself grace. Again, this doesn't happen all the time, so grant an allowance. And that's why I mentioned the need for self-discipline, because if you are excusing everything all the time, that is called excuses. As you give yourself grace, practice patience with yourself, because there are just some things in life we just don't get right the first time. Now, I know it may seem tricky when to buckle down and when to extend grace to yourself. And to that I say, always do both. Always do both. Always buckle down, have discipline, practice self-control, and also always give yourself grace. And I think the perfect example of that, the ultimate example of that, is the way in which God deals with us. God perfectly extends His grace, mercy, and justice always. I can't remember where I heard it, but there is a story of two boys who grew up together. They just did everything together. They had school together. They lived close by one another. They hung out after school. They hung out on the weekends, and essentially they just grew up like brothers. Long story short, they separated during college. Life just drifted them away. One of them did very, very well and became a lawyer and eventually a judge, while the other one really struggled through life, not going to school, and fell into a life of crime. The one who found himself in a life of crime also ended up finding himself in his friend's courtroom. The judge looked at his old friend and loved him. He remembered all of the times that they had, but he chose to give justice in that situation, which led to a very hefty fine. And because the criminal couldn't pay it, he had to serve time. After the judge's ruling, he got off of his podium, gave his old friend a hug, and paid his fine. That is only a small little example of the way that God is with us. And the way that God rules in this earth and deals with us, He is perfectly just in all of His ways, yet He is loving, merciful, and gracious to pay for all of our mistakes. Don't beat yourself up for the mistakes you've made, even if that mistake was just yesterday. Give yourself grace. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't feel disappointed or grieve, but that is not a place you should live. Live in grace.